All right, thanks. So starting off, I'll tell you a little story about me that kind of, I think, translates into where we're going today. So about 5 years ago, I applied for my current job, and before that, a lot of my experience had just been in weight management, helping people lose weight, getting better. I'd worked 2 years before that just as a before getting my PhD as a research assistant, doing food records every day, putting them in NDSR, learning how to analyze that NDSR data. If anyone's ever done that, you can kind of see there's a groan in me that thinks about that time in my life because it's pretty tedious and terrible. But it's work that needs to be done. So when I was applying for my job, I thought I really killed it. I gave this great presentation about diet and what is the best diet for weight loss and, waiting to hear. And I finally get that call and, they said, you're a dietitian, right? And I said, yeah. And they're like, you have lots of experience in dietary assessment. And I'm like, well, yeah. They're like, okay, great. We really want to bring you on, but we want one of your second tasks here to be improving our dietary analysis, starting to publish our data. I said, okay. And they go, and, we want you to reform how we collect our dietary assessment data. That's a big question. That's a big task. Oh, by the way, we just need you to completely change this up. So where does one go when you're tasked with that? Well, you start from the beginning. You have to find out what's out there. What have people been doing? What is the literature? And, where's it going? What's worked and what hasn't worked? So I had a different presentation in mind that I was going to give today. And yesterday, we had some great talks. I think we can all agree on that. And a lot of what I was going to say had already been said. So I thought, why don't we go back to the basics? Let's go back into what's out there right now. What have we used in the past for collecting these measurements? And what are some of the major limitations in using them? And why are we trying to improve them? And where can we go? So that's really what I'm going to be doing today. With that in mind, we have a lot to get through because there's a lot out there, both if I'm going to cover physical activity and energy intake. So I'm going to kind of breeze through these. We can talk later. We'll talk in the small groups. And I know a lot of people know this stuff. Some people don't, though. So quick acknowledgments. My funding comes from the NIH, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Kansas City, and the Healthy Weight Research Network. And of course, like many people, one person is not an island, so you have a whole team involved in helping you with your research every day. So I want to thank them. We're going to start off with dietary assessment. That's kind of my forte. As Rick talked about, we have our FFQs, our 24-hour diet recalls, and our diet records. I'm really going to concentrate more on the diet record today because I think Rick did a really good job kind of covering the FFQ. In general, we know these subjective assessments of energy intake aren't great. This is some work we did where we compared a 3-day food record to doubly labeled water, and these are actually in college-age students. But you can see on average they estimated a lot lower than what they actually ate. It comes out to about 17%, but there's a wide variability. As David said yesterday, even Dale Scholler came out and made the statement, going forward, we should accept that self-reported energy intake is fatally flawed. We should stop publishing inaccurate and misleading energy intake data. Great quote, great idea. How are we supposed to do that, though? What else can we do? We don't have an objective measure of energy intake. So what is out there and what can we do? So starting off, there's the old dietitian favorite, the weigh and measure technique. So for anyone not familiar, weigh and measure is normally done in more of a laboratory or cafeteria-based study where you know exactly how a food is prepared, what ingredients went into it, how much went into it, and then when you serve it, you measure it before serving, and then whoever your participant is eats whatever they want to eat, and then you take it back and measure each ingredient after serving, and you're able to figure out exactly how many grams they ate. So then you can go into your favorite nutrition process software and enter that into the detail. We know it's pretty close compared to doubly labeled water. We found it's about 3% error. So it's a really good assessment, but it's hard if you have someone you're paying to sit there and measure food before and after eating, especially if you're there at all times of the day, and then making all that food. It can take a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of money. And honestly, people don't really like doing it. So what else can we do to improve that? Well, one thing we've done is in the laboratory setting, at least, or in our cafeteria settings, we decided to go to more of a digital photography plus diet recall method. So this is the same thing where you're in a cafeteria, you know exactly how the food is prepared, what's in it, what the ingredients are, and students, what we use is students could eat whatever they want, get whatever they want on their plate, and when they go over to eat, instead of doing that weigh and measure, we have them take a photo. So there's a camera area set up. The camera's already at that angle we need it to be. They just put their food there, it snaps it, they go eat, they come back, put their food there again, it snaps the photo. All the food's on a different plate, so we can kind of be able to estimate it alone. We know exactly, they write out what the food is, so we know exactly what they're eating. And then we have staff who's been trained to be able to derive how much was consumed based on the photos, and we have these portion size markers there on the side. The nice thing about this is you have someone quickly write things out, so you can see up there's a soda. We don't know if that's diet or regular soda by looking at it, but because they wrote it down, we can see, oh, it is Diet Cola. Okay, we can enter that into our software. When doing this measure, we found about a 6.8% error compared to doubly labeled water. When we looked at that same time point and we did a 3-day food record, doubly labeled water we did for 2 weeks. The weigh and measure, or the digital photography, was 1 week, and then we did a 3-day food record after that. We found about a 16% error. So we improved it, but there's still error. One of the major problems is, at least in this study, it was college students, and we asked them to eat in the cafeteria 3 meals a day on the weekdays, 2 days on the weekends. They're college students. They're not going to eat all their meals in the cafeteria. We know that. So in order for us to capture what they were eating outside of that, we had to use the good old recall. So there's still some bias there. So again, you still have to rely on some kind of self-report recall for meals consumed away from the cafeteria. So the question becomes, okay, we know this is really only for cafeteria studies. It's not real world. It's not what most people want. It's really good for us who are energy balance researchers, but for trying to collect diet data in the real world, we can't use it. So what else is there? So kind of going off of this, you have the remote food photography. This was really became popular with Corey Martin a few years ago, in which they used smartphones for, they would have people just take photos of their smartphones, and Carol kind of talked about this yesterday in some of her work, and it goes to some kind of system. Normally there's a person on the other side who then goes and analyzes whatever food they're getting, writes in a computer whatever it is. They're asked to give prompts, so if they don't, they're asked to write in something like this is a banana or this is Diet Coke, or that way you can try to get additional details, but then, you have to rely on someone to remember to do that. You also have the E button, which we've also talked a lot about, but this, is the device that automatically takes photos of your food, and then it can be combined with food recognition software that we've talked a bit about. At least in terms of measuring volume, it does a pretty good job, and I didn't see it when I was working on this last night, but it doesn't look like there's been a whole lot of validation, at least in terms of energy intake. So we know volume's probably pretty good. We know that it's good at capturing those images, getting people to do it, but we're not sure how, if we're looking at energy intake as an outcome, what it is. But there's still limitations with this. Again, it requires some kind of recall or self-report. We were talking about that, but when you have images, you can't capture those mixed meals, those meals that are low fat versus high fat, Diet Coke versus regular, how something's prepared, if it uses butter, oil, nothing. So you're still relying on that person for some kind of detail. If you have a photo analysis software, that's great. If not, you still have staff who are trying to analyze those photos. And as we talked about with the E-button, it's big data. It takes a lot of time to go through and pull out, okay, what photos are we going to use? If you're using more of the mobile apps, you have to hope someone remembers to take the photos with them. And then you have some of the privacy concerns we talked about yesterday. Then we have our image-assisted records, which I think Carol did a good job talking about, but it's combining the 3-day food record with photos. So someone fills out that 3-day food record, and they also take the photos, and then when you review it, you have both that person there and the photos. So maybe you're going through your record, and you're looking at the photos at the same time, you realize, for lunch, on the photo, there's clearly a milk there, and they didn't write that down. So okay, now I know there's also milk. I can add that to my thing, and you have the person there, so you can say, okay, I see you had milk on Saturday. Was that skim milk, 2% whole? What type of milk was it? And then you get that additional detail. So you have the benefit of both the photos and the person. However, this is a high participant burden because not only are they still having to do those 3-day food records, not everyone loves to do, but they're also taking photos with it. And then it's a high researcher burden because you still have to review all these things with them. Also, kind of Carol said, while these studies have really shown to improve estimates anywhere from 10 to 54%, that's per day and per meal, it's not been validated compared to weigh and measure, doubly labeled water, some of the validation standards that we like. And then kind of going into what both Rick and Carol talked about, you have the automatic image analysis. So this is when you just have the photo you take kind of with a mobile app of your food. It goes through and it's able to detect what type of food it is and how much volume. But again, you're still trying to get people to take these photos of the food. We know that adolescents are kind of better at actually remembering to capture the images. Adults can take better quality images. And then there's still some high volume error for condiments, which don't truly contribute that much to your overall nutrition intake and caloric intake. But, and they're improving with time, but you're still stuck with that detail. You can't determine some details of food in those hidden foods. We have your commercial apps, which, Lucid and MyFitnessPal seem to be the two most popular right now. But they're really just glorified dietary records. In any other way, you're still going in there and having to enter all your food and remember it. They've done a couple cool things. So Lose It now has this Snap It that Carol talked about, where you are supposed to take a photo of your food and it tells you what it thinks it is. I tried it last night and it came up with crackers. That was actually a peanut butter cracker. But I've tried it a couple weeks ago and it was a picture of a cinnamon roll I found and I thought it was quinoa. So there's really a lot of improvement that it still needs in these commercial apps, but at least they're trying. And then they have the barcode scanners. MyFitnessPal's kind of nice because you can enter in where you are, it finds you, and it finds the restaurants that are close by. And if they happen to have a list of the foods there, that pulls up. So if it says Olive Garden's nearby, it will give you the menu from Olive Garden and the exact calories. So it's trying to make it a little bit better. These devices are also nice because they integrate exercise. So if you have a consumer wearable, so your Jawbone, your Apple Watch, your Samsung, your Fitbit, whatever it is, you can link them together and it will kind of pull up your exercise calories based on whatever that device estimates. So it kind of gives you a nice overall picture of how you're doing, but it's still self-report. People don't always like to report it out, and data can be difficult to export for outcome analysis. So if we're trying to use this as researchers, at least as I'm a researcher, I like data. I like lots of data. And, when I'm trying to download lots of data from different people's MyFitnessPals, it can become pretty tedious. Things are different. We don't know if they're accurately entered. You don't know if it comes from a USDA database or if it's like a user entry. And poor long-term compliance. One of my colleagues recently did a study, and he had people use MyFitnessPal for 6 months, trying to track everything they ate. People only filled it out 37% of the time. They had a calorie goal, 44. They only met that calorie goal within 100 calories, 44% of days. And most of the time it was much lower. What that meant is they were entering foods for breakfast and lunch, and then they would kind of forget. So they never actually entered in all their food. So if you're looking at that, we're like, oh, they're doing great. They're only eating 1,200 calories a day. Well, that's not true. That's just what they're entering. Moving on into some of the other things, and I think hopefully Ed's talking later because I don't understand this as much, but I try to get the best understanding I could of some of these really neat devices they're coming up with. So first you have some of the monitoring of hand gestures, and this is kind of looking at bite frequency and energy intake. So what they say is, the more bites you're taking and the more times you take, do this hand to mouth technique, you're probably consuming more. And they've even derived some of these equations on how many calories or how much energy is in a typical bite in both men and women and the different BMI classes. So what this is saying is that, probably the more bites you're consuming, the more you eat. You then have these swallowing monitors, which measure, how many times someone's swallowing or eating food. And the idea, again, is the more swallows you have, the more you're probably consuming. And they're pretty accurate at identifying when a person's eating food. As far as I can tell, there hasn't been a lot done to see if they're accurate in terms of how much a person's eating. And then some of the ingestion monitors we've been hearing about, which really are combining that jaw motion and that hand motion, and even accelerometer, so you can really see what's going on. And again, they're pretty good in telling, okay, this person's actually eating food when they're eating food versus, drinking water. But they're still, at least it seems to me, kind of working on, okay, so how much food are they eating? What type of foods are they eating? The problem is, they're still new. The cost, inconvenient. I know in our green group yesterday we were talking about people don't like to wear these collars. People don't like to wear giant things on their heads when they're trying to eat. And a lot of times when you're doing that, you might have some bias. I'm wearing a big collar on me and a device. I might be eating a little differently than I normally would. And so you're still kind of in that, if you're looking at energy intake and macronutrient intake, you're still kind of relying on these measures of estimates of converting, how many bites or how much energy is in a bite. So there's still, it seems like a lot of work that needs to be done. And then Rick kind of talked about this, but you have these devices that you can hold up and it tells you what food you're eating and what the nutrients are for that food. Can send it even to a smartphone device, and so you have this database. Problem is, like, it doesn't tell you how much, and that's really the big problem. So a couple things to consider in terms of dietary intake. There's been a lot of technology advances in dietary assessment, but there's still a lot that needs to be done. We really need to get more validation going. We need to figure out how accurate and precise these measures are, and especially, your different outcomes of interest. If all you care about is portion size, well, then there's some good things out there that are really good at now measuring portion size. But if you really want to look at what is that food, what's the composition of it, then you're going to need a different set or a different device. And then our challenges, of course, are the cost. Some of these things get really costly. And then when you're doing a big study where you're maybe doing energy intake and energy expenditure, changing behaviors, you can't put all your money into one side. And then you have your participant burden, so getting them to wear the device or take the photos, and then any kind of bias that comes with that. So really, we were talking yesterday, again, back to my great green group, but it was, I'm about to write this grant, or I'm about to write this protocol. What am I supposed to put in? And so I think it really comes down to your outcome. What is your outcome of interest? Do you care about energy intake? Do you care about your macro and micronutrient intake? Are you really looking at just change over time? Or are you really trying to get an absolute value? And then, what is the reliability and validity for that outcome of interest? It might be different. And then you have to decide, for your study, what is the amount of burden you want to give both the participant and yourself? And then how much money do you have to spend? So moving on, we're going to go into physical activity. As most of you guys know, we have subjective and objective measures of physical activity. I'm going to mostly concentrate on the objective measures because we know those are a little bit better, and again, we're trying to get away from self-report. So in a perfect research world, we would keep everyone in a little bubble. It would be really nice if we could have everyone come in and keep them in a cage and watch everything they do and learn everything about them. If someone's exercising, let's hook them up to a calorimeter and find out exactly how much energy they're burning during exercise. Let's watch someone and give them feedback while they're exercising, or look at their heart rate, look at their intensity, look at what speed they're going on. But we don't live in that perfect world. We can't do that for the most part. So we have to rely on the next best thing, which seems to be these devices. So I wanted to go through what are the devices out there, and what's working and what's not. So first you have your basic pedometer. I like to call this kind of the old school device, but it's tried and true, at least for some people, for behavior change. Normally they're just little devices and they're spring loaded, so their accuracy is not too great, but they're pretty inexpensive. You can go to like Walmart, I think, and get one for $5, strap it on. At least gives you an idea of how much you're moving. Again, normally they just tell you steps, so you have to go from there. What do steps mean? Some people have tried to come up with these tables on, how do steps classify physical activity. And some of the pedometers are getting better and better, more like accelerometers, in which you can download them to a computer and download the data. But in general, they still just provide steps, and they can be really easy to manipulate. I don't know if you've ever seen anyone sit there with a little pedometer shaking it, and they can easily get 10,000 steps a day just going like that. Or maybe, there's always a story I know of someone who one time was like cutting the Thanksgiving turkey, and then they looked down and, they were up to like 5,000 steps for that day just cutting their turkey. So, they're not the greatest device, and minute by minute data isn't always available. And then there's the heart rate monitor, and I know I heard a couple people talking about this yesterday. Well, why don't we just use heart rate for physical activity? Heart rate monitors they're convenient, they're relatively inexpensive. Typically you have your chest strap that you wear here, and it connects to a watch that you wear on your wrist. The watch collects all the data, or gets all the data transmitted from the chest strap, and then you can download that onto a computer and use it for analysis. From there, a lot of times you're able to quantify the intensity of that exercise based on heart rate, so kind of compare it to a heart rate max, and then you can determine energy expenditure. And it's used to estimate energy expenditure, if you're looking at that, kind of based on this assumption of a linear relationship between heart rate and VO2. Problem is, they're really good for exercise, and most people are fine with wearing that chest strap for their 45, maybe 60 minutes when they're in their sweaty exercise clothes. And so you can get a lot of good information about, how hard is this person working while they're exercising, what's the intensity, how many calories are they burning. But if you wanted to get more of a picture of someone's the big picture of their daily life, well, one, you would have to get them to wear the chest strap all day. And that's a bigger issue. People don't want to wear that chest strap when they're wearing their normal clothes, and they don't want to wear it all day. It kind of gets itchy after a while. And there's also not a very clear relationship between heart rate and energy expenditure. Well, while we know heart rate and energy expenditure, there's a good relationship. It's not really the case during light activity or actually very, very vigorous activity. But there's kind of a curve. And so that when you get to this lower end of the VO2 max scale, there's a really poor association between the energy intake and heart rate at that point. So it's not very good for someone who's just sitting or walking around to really measure. And then the relationship between heart rate and VO2 max differs between upper and body lower activity. So you can't use the same curves, and most people try to. All right, going on, we have kind of everyone's favorite, the accelerometer. So this is just, this one is the hip-based accelerometer. So this is the small hip-worn device. It detects accelerations of the body. It's now, most of the current models have 3 axes on them. They used to just have 1. But it seems to be the most used device among research groups. I found this nice little graph from Rick, actually, just showing, this goes up to 2013, but you can see kind of even in the last few years, the amount of people publishing data with accelerometers has just increased. It's very popular. People like to use it. And as we said yesterday, why? Why does everyone go to that? And it's because it's what we know. It's what's out there. It's what's supposedly validated. It's what people are familiar with. It still has its issues. One, participant compliance. If you're using those, what we like to call, valid wear times, you're looking and someone needs to be wearing this device for 4 to 7 days for about 10 hours a day. And that's remembering to keep it on, actually being okay with wearing the device. And then you do have some issues. So depending on what physical activity, it's really good at picking up like walking, running, moving. But if you have someone who's going to the gym and maybe doing like the HIIT training or the boot camps where you're more staying still and doing some jumping jacks and then lifting weights and still getting your heart up there, it's not going to pick that up as much. It also can't differentiate if you're doing kind of an uphill walk versus level. It can't tell that you're using, or if you have resistance with you. So you're probably, if I'm like walking up a really steep hill, kind of like if anyone walked back last night, there's a nice little hill here on campus. My heart rate, it was getting up. I could tell just going up that hill. But, for an accelerometer, it's not going to see that a whole lot differently than if I were, going straight. And so it's not going to differentiate that maybe my VO2 max was higher, I was burning more energy. We've talked about how they're not as good at detecting sitting versus standing time, or at least the kind of motion from sit to stand and how often you do that. We're still relying on counts. What is a count? Why is count what we chose to measure physical activity? I think we've kind of moved past counts, but and then with that, there's no uniform cut points. So a lot of people use the NIH cut points to determine this is light activity, this is moderate activity, this is vigorous activity. But there are different cut points out there, and I've heard people say, "Oh, well, you can pick the cut point that works best with your data." Well, that's not really the way it should be done. And then when you're comparing it across time, when you're picking, looking at different research studies and comparing it and what worked different, if everyone's using different cut points, how can you really compare anything? And then there's still questions on how do these counts convert to really energy expenditure, and is that right? So one thing they've tried to do is some of these wrist-worn accelerometers, moving it to the wrist. What we found is you get better compliance with that, but the correlation between counts and energy expenditure is even lower. A lot of people are still trying to use the algorithms they would use for the hip on the wrist, and those really can't be used. We're still waiting for like some good NIH cut points to come out and say this is this different type of activity. So they still have some issues. SenseWear was a really great device. This was more for, instead of measuring physical activity, measuring energy expenditure. So you wore it up here kind of on top of your arm, and it had a lot of different sensors that could try to capture energy expenditure better than just an accelerometer. Some people didn't like to wear them up there because they showed off a little bit more, but I think the bigger problem with the SenseWear was Jawbone bought out Body Media in 2014, and they decided to stop producing the SenseWear and use those sensors for their commercial devices like the Jawbone devices. So anyone who had been using these now has to keep using their old models and hoping they'll hold on for as long as possible, but there's no support for them anymore. So once they die, they die. And we're still hoping, maybe someone will bring this back, but you don't know. Asta Pal, This measures sitting to standing really well, so it's a better device. A lot of people will combine the Asta Pal with an accelerometer to try to get the best data. It goes on the arm. And you have some of these other intelligent devices where they're putting multiple sensors all over people, trying to capture different postures and what's going on. But the difficulty of attaching them is still there. There's inconvenience in wearing the sensors, and they're still kind of being created. So now we get into everyone's favorite, the consumer physical activity model, or physical activity trackers. So these are our Jawbones, our Fitbits, our Apple Watches, our Samsung devices. It seems like it's just blown up the market in the last few years. Everyone's wearing these. And they can be nice because they can combine an accelerometer. Some of them have heart rate monitors in there. Some of them have the old sensors from the SenseWear in them. They're pretty popular. They can upload your data wirelessly. The problem, though, that comes back to is what is the accuracy? What is the validity? What is the precision of these? A lot of times these devices are being redeveloped faster than we can keep up with as researchers who are trying to sit there and validate them, or, at least see if they're reliable. So, you come up with your answer and you're like, okay, well, this wasn't the greatest device. It's that one. They're like, well, that device was actually discontinued a year and a half ago, and we've, made it bigger and better, and now you can go buy it here, and this one's going to be good. Okay, so I'll validate that. So you spend all your time getting the money validating it. Well, now that one's been discontinued, and we're on to the next one. So it's kind of hard to keep up with them. A lot of people have done a lot of work with the Fitbit Flex because that one's been around for a little bit now. And it's inconsistent data if it's accurate. Some people have compared them to actigraphs, and they're like, this is great. Well, okay, you're comparing it to another model. And then they go and they compare it, to like a doubly labeled water, and they're like, oh, this isn't so great. Or, it's all inconsistent, and everyone's doing different methods to try to decide what is validity. The other thing, we've talked about is, do you need them? Do you really care if they're actually accurate? Do you care if someone has gotten 10,000 steps in and 42 minutes of physical activity? Or do you care that they're precise and you can look at that change? And then, they're not designed for research. These are designed for someone to wear off the street, for someone to gain better data. So researchers coming in, if you're trying to, get advice from multiple devices, it can be difficult. You do have some third-party groups like Fitabase and other things who are trying to turn these into research databases, but then you have to pay for that. And if you're doing a small pilot or you don't have a ton of money, that can be a huge limitation. The other thing is manufacturers are not providing their cut points or algorithms or how they're getting their energy expenditure. So it will tell you, if I look at my Fitbit, I got this, 15 minutes of light activity, 10 minutes of vigorous, 60 minutes of moderate. Okay, that's great, but what does that mean? I don't know where you're getting that information from. And, you burn 600 calories a day from exercise. Okay, but how did you decide that? And we don't know. And some people at least don't. Some people like this, some people don't. They provide immediate feedback. So if I look here, I can see I've gotten 3,500 steps today. Okay, but, maybe I'm like, oh, I really need to get walking more. So if you're trying to use this for someone else, or if you're trying to use this and you don't want people to get that, feedback, then that can be an issue. Now, I know the John Jakisek paper came out and said it doesn't matter. People are going to wear these and it doesn't actually change behavior, but it's still a concern. The other thing is these multiple devices. So as you can see, we have a lot of devices, and some of them are really good at one thing, but they're not good at that many others. So if you're really trying to capture everything, you might end up with someone wearing an accelerometer, consumer physical activity monitor, an Asta Pal, and they're loaded up with these things walking around all day. And then how do you deal with that? How do you, combine all that data and make it meaningful and make it mean something? And how do you keep someone from looking like this as they're walking around every day? So what can we do to get maybe one device that can do everything? So back to these considerations, back to, okay, I'm writing my protocol. What am I supposed to put in here? So it really, I think, comes back to, again, what is your intended use? Do you care about physical activity? Do you care about energy expenditure? Do you really just want to know sedentary time? And then, how important is having that reliability and validity data? What do you really need from it? What are your participants willing to do? What is the cost that you have? And, what kind of convenience do you want as the researcher? So my key takeaways from all of this are there's a lot of stuff out there. And there's a lot of stuff that's been developed. And it's kind of like, okay, so what do we do with it all? Where are we going? we just know it's still a challenge. We have all these great tools and people keep coming up with more and more, but it seems like everything still has kind of a limitation with it that we really, as researchers, and I think what's really important with this group is, okay, this is what we have. How can we answer these questions? How can we get over these limitations? So we really do need more research to kind of start to improve these things, to validate this technology, to get it out there and make it work for people. And I think the biggest considerations coming out are the validity, are the participant burden, and of course are the costs to the researcher. So just some things to think about, and hopefully, we're about to have our small groups, and these are some things we can talk about. So thank you for listening to my very fast-paced talk.